The candles on the table at Hartwell Inn had been lit for no one. 7 of them. Tall, ivory tapers set in a silver holder the innkeeper's wife polished every Christmas Eve out of some quiet, habitual mercy. They cast their light on a single-place setting. 1 china plate, 1 crystal glass, 1 folded linen napkin, and a small arrangement of holly berries someone had thought to place there, though no one had been asked. It was the 4th year Lady Cecily Ashmore had eaten Christmas dinner alone. Not alone as one is alone in a crowded room, that particular loneliness she had long since mastered, but truly, completely, exquisitely alone. No family to her left, no conversation to her right, only the distant sound of other guests laughing in the parlor, and the snow falling soundlessly against the black windows, and the steady tick of a clock on the mantel that seemed, tonight, to count something other than time. She had ordered the roast pheasant, though she wasn't hungry. She had dressed in her best remaining gown. Deep green silk, 3 seasons old but carefully maintained, because her mother had always said that one ought to dress for dinner regardless of the audience, and habits formed by the dead are the hardest ones to bury. She was reaching for her wine when the chair across from her moved, not pushed aside, not knocked by a passing footman, deliberately, purposefully moved, pulled back from the table with a sound like a quiet declaration, and then occupied without invitation, without apology, without so much as a preliminary clearing of the throat, by the Duke of Ravenscroft. Cecily's hand stilled on the stem of her glass. He was exactly as she had always heard him described and somehow nothing like she had imagined. Tall, dark-coated, his jaw carrying 2 days of shadow that no duke ought to permit and that somehow looked entirely intentional. His eyes, gray as the December sky outside, settled on her with an expression she could not immediately name. No pity. She would have left the table for pity, not condescension. She had endured enough of that to recognize it at 50 paces. Something else. Something almost like recognition. You appear, he said, to have a surplus of pheasant and a shortage of company. Cecily stared at him for one long moment. And you, she replied carefully, appear to have a surplus of audacity and a shortage of invitation. The Duke of Ravenscroft looked at her across the candlelight, and to her absolute bewilderment, he smiled. Then we are perfectly matched, he said. Shall I pour the wine, or would you prefer I leave? She should have said, leave. She should have called for the innkeeper, produced her most effective expression of aristocratic displeasure, and sent him back to whatever warm, attended Christmas table certainly waited for a man of his position and consequence. She said neither of these things. The decanter, she heard herself answer, is on your left. To understand why Lady Cecily Ashmore was eating Christmas dinner alone at Hartwell Inn, one must understand something about the architecture of a quiet ruin. Not the dramatic kind, not the sudden crash of scandal or the public spectacle of disgrace. The Ashmore family's diminishment had been the other sort entirely. Slow, patient, almost polite in its thoroughness. A series of poor harvests. A brother whose tastes outpaced his income by several elegant miles. A father whose trust in certain gentlemen proved, posthumously, to have been catastrophically misplaced. By the time Cecily was 24, the Ashmore estate in Wiltshire had been let to a manufacturer from Birmingham who had the decency to feel embarrassed about it. Her mother had died the previous spring, leaving behind a collection of French novels, a reputation for wit, and debts that consumed what remained of the furniture. Her brother Thomas had gone to Edinburgh for reasons no one discussed openly, and Cecily had done what sensible women of reduced circumstance do. She had found a position, not as a governess, her pride had initially balked at that, but as a companion. First to Lady Morrow of Bath, a demanding woman of 70 who appreciated Cecily's French and resented her opinions. Then, after 18 months, to old Mrs. Pemberton of Dorset, who had proved kinder, and whose death in October had left Cecily with a small legacy, a letter of reference, and nowhere in particular to be for Christmas. She had chosen Hartwell Inn in Somerset because it was midway between the life she'd come from and the life she was going to. A new position in Yorkshire, beginning in January, and because the innkeeper's wife had a reputation for decent pheasant and no reputation whatsoever for pity. She had not accounted for the Duke. His Grace Edmund Cavendish Vane, 7th Duke of Ravenscroft, had not intended to be at Hartwell Inn on Christmas Day. He had intended, as he had intended for the past 3 years, to be at Ravenscroft Park in Derbyshire, presiding over the sort of Christmas gathering that a man of his station was expected to preside over. 40 guests, 12 courses, a Yule log the size of a small tree, and his mother, the Dowager Duchess, at the head of the table with the expression she reserved for occasions that required both magnificence and mild suffering. He had left London on the 23rd with every intention of completing the journey. He had stopped at Hartwell on the 24th for a change of horses, and the axle of his carriage had, with spectacular ill-timing, disagreed with a stone bridge outside the village. The repairs, his coachman informed him with visible reluctance, would require 2 days at minimum. The Duke had surveyed the inn. The inn had surveyed the Duke. And then a curious thing had happened. Instead of dispatching a rider to Ravenscroft Park with word of his delay and arranging to be collected, Edmund Vane had said, to no one in particular, and to his own considerable surprise, "I'll stay." He could not have explained it, precisely. Only that the prospect of 40 guests and 12 courses and his mother's expression had seemed, in that moment, infinitely more exhausting than a Christmas at a country inn with a decent fire and no social obligations whatsoever. He had eaten alone in his room on Christmas Eve. On Christmas Day, descending for dinner with the appetite of a man who had spent the morning walking in snow for no purpose beyond the pleasure of it. He had passed the dining-room doorway and stopped. There was a woman at the corner table. She sat with the particular uprightness of someone who has decided, consciously and with some effort, not to appear as lonely as she is. Her gown was green. Her dark hair was neatly dressed. Before her were 7 candles and 1 empty chair and a glass of wine she had not yet touched. She was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone conducting an internal argument they have already decided to lose. Edmund Vane had looked at her for 15 seconds. Then he walked into the dining room and pulled out her chair. The first hour of their dinner was, if not precisely comfortable, at least remarkably honest. Cecily had not asked him to stay. She had not thanked him for arriving. She had allowed him to pour her wine, accepted the basket of bread a startled footman produced, and proceeded to engage him in the sort of conversation that makes absolutely clear one is perfectly capable of interesting discourse without requiring it to lead anywhere. They talked about the road conditions south of Bath. They talked about the quality of Somerset pheasant versus its Wiltshire equivalent. They talked, and this was where Cecily first felt the faint, inconvenient stirring of something other than wariness, about Milton. She had mentioned Paradise Lost only in passing, a reference to the snow outside that struck her as appropriately bleak. The Duke had not nodded politely and changed the subject, as men of consequence invariably did when women demonstrated literary familiarity. He had leaned forward slightly and said, "Book 4 or Book 9? Because I find the quality of one's loneliness rather determines which half of the poem one lives in." Cecily had looked at him. "Book 4, she said. "I've always found despair more tolerable than temptation." Something shifted in his expression. Quick, almost invisible, like light crossing water. "Most people prefer the temptation," he said. "Most people haven't considered the consequences." A pause. Then, "What are you doing at a Somerset Inn on Christmas Day, lady?" "Ashmore. Cecily Ashmore." She watched him for the flicker of recognition. Ashmore, the family that had sold the Wiltshire estate to a Birmingham manufacturer, and saw it come and go without cruelty. "And I might ask you the same, your grace." "Broken axle." "Ah, you." She considered the truthful answer and the dignified answer and found, with some surprise, that she was too tired for anything but the former. "Nowhere else to be," she said. He received this without flinching and without filling the silence with sympathetic noise, which she found, obscurely, the most respectful response he could have offered. "Neither do I," he said. "Tonight, at least." They ate their pheasant. The candles burned down half an inch. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work. "You mentioned Milton," he said eventually. "Do you read philosophy as well? Or is that too much to hope for in a country inn at Christmas?" "Locke primarily. Some Hume when I want an argument I can't win." "And you argue with books?" "Regularly. They're excellent conversationalists. They never talk over you." The Duke looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular quality of attention one rarely receives, as if her words were not being heard but actually listened to. "I found the same thing," he said, "though I'll confess the return conversation is somewhat one-sided." "That's the luxury of it." "Is it?" His voice was quiet. I've always thought about it rather than the loneliness of it. The word fell between them like something neither had intended to say aloud. Cecily reached for her wine. The Duke looked briefly out the window, at the snow and the dark beyond. Forgive me, he said. Nothing to forgive, she answered. You're the first person in 4 years who has spoken to me at Christmas dinner. I am not inclined to object to honesty. He turned back to look at her. 4 years. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. My mother died the year before last. Before that, my father. My brother is. She paused, choosing the precise word carefully. Unavailable. I'm sorry, he said. Are you? She did not say it cruelly. Genuinely curious. Yes. And the strange thing was, the truly inconvenient thing, that he sounded as though he meant it. They did not part until 11 o'clock. Between the pheasant and the departure they had consumed 2 bottles of a surprisingly decent Burgundy, discussed the state of the poor laws with enough passion that the innkeeper's wife checked the doorway twice to confirm no one was quarreling, argued pleasantly about whether Beethoven or Mozart demonstrated greater emotional intelligence in their late compositions, and, in a moment Cecily would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, sat in companionable silence for nearly 10 minutes while the fire burned low and neither of them felt any urgency to disturb it. When he stood to leave, he bowed with perfect formality. Thank you, Lady Cecily, he said, for the company. You invited yourself, she reminded him. So I did, the faintest smile. And I find I'm not even slightly sorry about it. She watched him leave and then sat for a moment in the candlelight, her hands folded in her lap. Aware of something she had not felt in so long, she had to search for the word. Warm. She felt warm. Not from the wine. Not from the fire. From having been, for 3 hours on Christmas night, genuinely, unreservedly treated as a person worth talking to. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this with the particular conviction of someone who knows they are lying. The following morning he was still there. She came down for breakfast at 8 o'clock to find the Duke of Ravenscroft at the window of the inn's small parlor with a cup of coffee and a London newspaper, his coat impeccable, his expression suggesting he had slept well and harbored no social complications whatsoever about occupying the only comfortable chair. The axle, he said, without looking up from the paper, will not be repaired until tomorrow afternoon. I see, Cecily said, and sat down at the table. A maid appeared with toast and tea before she had time to ask. There is apparently, the Duke continued, turning a page, also a rather good library on the 2nd floor. The innkeeper's late father was a great collector of natural philosophy. I found Erasmus Darwin and at least 2 volumes of Newton. You're going to read Newton on Boxing Day? He finally looked up. Would you like to read Newton on Boxing Day? She should have said no. She had letters to write, a position to prepare for, a life to reassemble in Yorkshire. She had no business spending a second day in the company of a duke who had broken his journey in Somerset and seemed in no particular hurry to mend it. Yes, she said. After breakfast. The library was small, cold, and perfect. They read for 2 hours in adjacent chairs before the fire, separately and in comfortable proximity, each occasionally reading a passage aloud to the other with the ease of people who have been having this exact conversation for years, though they had known each other for less than a day. It was Edmund who first said something that could not be mistaken for casual. He had put down his volume. He had migrated from Newton to a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius, and was looking at the fire with an expression that suggested he was thinking about something other than what he appeared to be thinking about. Do you mind, he said slowly, if I ask you something personal? You may ask, Cecily said, which was not quite the same as saying he might receive an answer. The position in Yorkshire. Is it what you want? She looked up from her book. It is what I have. That isn't the same thing. No, she agreed. It isn't. She set down Darwin. What I want is not a particularly productive subject, Your Grace. I find it easier to navigate what is available to me. That's very practical. It is. And rather sad, he added, not unkindly. She felt the familiar prickle of defensiveness. I don't require your pity. I'm not offering pity. He turned to look at her, and his expression was entirely serious. I recognize the condition. I've spent the last 4 years navigating what is available to me rather than what I want. I recognize it very clearly. Cecily looked at him. The 7th Duke of Ravenscroft, one of the wealthiest men in England, with estates in 3 counties and a seat in the House of Lords and every social advantage the world knew how to confer. What could you possibly, she began, want that I haven't been allowed? He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. That is precisely the question people forget to ask of men like me. The fire crackled. The snow outside the window had paused, and a pale December sun was making its tentative debut over the Somerset hills. What do you want? Cecily asked. She meant it genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. Then, something real, he said, which I am increasingly convinced is rarer than any material thing I possess. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have accidentally told each other the truth and are deciding, together, what to do about it. The axle was not repaired on the afternoon of the 26th. The blacksmith, a man of formidable competence and philosophical unhurriedness, announced that the metal required had been sent for from Taunton, that Taunton was some distance away and not inclined to rush on account of the season, and that his Grace's equipage would be entirely roadworthy by the morning of the 28th at the very outside. Edmund received this information with an expression of perfect calm and went directly to inform Lady Cecily. He found her in the inn's small garden, standing in the snow in her cloak, looking at something in the holly hedge with the focused attention of someone who has decided to think about plants rather than the thing they are actually thinking about. 2 more days, he said. She turned. Your axle. My axle. A pause. I see. Lady Cecily. He came to stand beside her, close enough to speak quietly. I want to be clear about something. I am not making a nuisance of myself intentionally. If my continued presence here is an imposition, I will find another arrangement. She looked at him for a moment. He was genuinely asking. That, she was beginning to understand, was a characteristic of his. He asked questions he could not predict the answers to, which was either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary courage, and she had not yet determined which. It is not an imposition, she said. Good. Something in his posture eased, barely perceptibly. Then perhaps you might show me whatever it is you've found so interesting in that hedge. She turned back to the holly. A wren, she said. It's been sitting there for 20 minutes. Perfectly still. They both looked. The wren was indeed still. A small, improbable brown shape among the red berries, not sleeping, just waiting. My mother used to say, Cecily said, that a wren on Christmas means the year will end well. Do you believe that? No, a beat. But I like the sentiment. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply stood beside her in the snow until the wren, apparently satisfied with whatever it had been waiting for, lifted and disappeared into the gray December sky. Come inside, Edmund said, before you freeze. I'm not cold. Your hands are, Lady Cecily. I can see it from here. She looked down at her hands. Her gloves were thin. She had better ones, but they were packed for Yorkshire. It's fine. Here. He removed his own gloves, thick, good leather, and held them out. She stared at them. Your Grace, I cannot. They're too large for you, he said. And you'll be uncomfortable for the next 10 minutes until your good sense overrules your pride. But I'd rather give you 10 minutes. She wanted to argue. She could not quite find the argument. She took the gloves. The following morning, the 27th, a letter arrived for Cecily. She read it at the breakfast table, and Edmund, arriving 3 minutes later, found her sitting very still with the paper open in her hands and an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not sadness, exactly, but the particular blankness that comes before sadness, when the mind has received news it has not yet allowed the heart to process. He sat down across from her without speaking and poured his coffee. After a moment, without prompting, she said, The position in Yorkshire has been filled. He was quiet. The family found a relation willing to serve, she continued, her voice entirely steady. Which is, of course, the natural preference. She folded the letter with the care of someone who needs something to do with their hands. So I am, as of this moment, without a position or a destination. I see, he said. It is not, she added, with a precision that suggested she was reassuring herself as much as him. The end of the world. There are other positions. I have good references. Yes, he said. It is simply, she stopped. Simply what? A pause. I had a plan, she said. I find the absence of a plan somewhat disorienting. Edmund set down his coffee cup. Lady Cecily. Please, she said, and her voice was quiet but firm. Don't say something kind. I'm managing perfectly well, and I will continue to manage perfectly well, and kindness will make it considerably harder. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the expression of a man who has decided to follow an instruction even when he disagrees with it, you are right that you'll manage. You've managed rather extraordinary things with rather limited resources. That is evident to anyone paying attention. It was not exactly kind. It was something better, true. She looked at him. Her jaw worked very slightly. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. I'm only observing. Nevertheless, they ate breakfast in a silence that was no longer entirely comfortable but was honest in a way that felt, somehow, more important than comfort. By the afternoon of the 27th, Cecily had begun to understand what she was dealing with. Not the Duke's character, that was revealing itself with a thoroughness that was as unsettling as it was, against her better judgment, increasingly welcome. She had begun to understand what she was dealing with in herself. She was in the library again, nominally reading Erasmus Darwin, actually watching Edmund. He had asked her to call him Edmund, quietly, on the previous evening, and she had not refused. Work through a set of estate correspondence that his steward had forwarded to the inn. He was frowning at a document about drainage on the Derbyshire property, making occasional notes in the margin with a precision that suggested a man who took his responsibilities seriously and not merely as an assertion of status. She found this more attractive than she was prepared for. She found, if she was being entirely honest with herself, most things about him were more attractive than she was prepared for. The intelligence, the directness, the fact that he had given her his gloves and then said absolutely nothing more about it. The way he looked up from his work occasionally and caught her eye and didn't immediately look away. He was, she told herself firmly, a duke. She reminded herself with equal firmness, a woman of no fortune, reduced circumstance, and the kind of family history that society did not forget. And yet, you're staring, he said, without looking up from the drainage document. I'm reading, she said. You haven't turned a page in 20 minutes. Darwin is dense. Darwin is not that dense. He looked up then, and she had no defense prepared. His expression was, not teasing quite, but warm in a way that made the warmth she had felt 2 nights ago at the dinner table return with force. Edmund, she stopped. Yes. Nothing, she said. Never mind. He held her gaze for 1 moment longer than was strictly accounted for by conversation. Then, quietly, he returned to his drainage document. Cecily turned her page. She read nothing on it. That evening, sitting together after supper while sleet tapped against the windows, Edmund told her about his father. She had not asked. He told her with the quality of someone unburdening something that had been carried too long in a container slightly too small for it. The Duke, his father, had been brilliant, demanding, loved and feared in equal measure, dead at 53 of a heart complaint that had given no warning. The title came to Edmund at 26. The weight of it, the years since managing estates, attending Parliament, fulfilling every obligation with a thoroughness that left him, he said, carefully, quietly, thoroughly exhausted and somehow entirely alone. You have people, Cecily said softly, a household, a family. I have attendants and relations, he said. There is a difference. She knew the difference. She had felt it acutely, in every room she had ever occupied as a companion, sitting with women who needed her presence without requiring her person. Yes, she said, there is. You understand it, he said, and the surprise in his voice was almost imperceptible, but she heard it. I've been a professional ghost for 3 years, she said. Present but unsubstantial. Required but not real to the people who require me. He was quiet for a long moment. That is not, he stopped. Not what? Not how I see you, he said. For whatever that is worth. She should have deflected. She should have made a light remark and turned the conversation onto safer ground. She was very good at safer ground. It is worth something, she said instead, and her voice was not entirely steady. It is worth quite a lot, actually. He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. Then he reached out, slowly, deliberately, and covered her hand with his. Not a claim, just a rest, a warmth, and said nothing more, and she did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time while the sleet came down outside and the fire burned in the grate and the year prepared, quietly, to end. She was gone before he came down on the morning of the 28th. He knew it before he saw the empty table, before the innkeeper's wife approached with an expression suggesting both sympathy and the desire not to be involved. He knew it the way one knows a room has changed before one has identified what has been removed from it. The note was brief. She had given him the small, careful handwriting of someone who has long since learned to say the important things in the fewest possible words. Your Grace, the road south reopened this morning. I have secured a seat on the coach to Bath, where I have a distant connection who may know of positions. Please do not trouble yourself on my account. I have been very much more comfortable these past 3 days than I had any right to expect. I am grateful. C.A. Edmund read it twice. Then he put it in his coat pocket, told his coachman to be ready in 10 minutes, and went upstairs to repack his trunk with a controlled efficiency that his valet, a man of 12 years' service who recognized certain moods on sight, correctly interpreted as requiring absolute silence. The axle, it had emerged, had been repaired since yesterday afternoon. The blacksmith, it seemed, had completed the work early and then, with a kind of Somerset logic Edmund could not quite fault, had assumed his Grace was in no hurry and would be informed when the matter arose. He had been in no hurry. He was in considerable hurry now. The Bath road in late December was not forgiving. Ice lay in patches across the stone, the sky was the flat white of a sky that intended more snow, and the coach to Bath, which left Hartwell at 8 in the morning, had a considerable head start on a private carriage that had only been summoned at 9. His coachman, who had heard nothing explicit but had absorbed the general atmosphere of urgency, drove with a speed that the road did not particularly recommend. Edmund sat in the carriage and looked at the note again. I am grateful. That was what stopped him. Not the goodbye. He had half expected a goodbye, had recognized yesterday evening, even as the evening had been everything he had not known he was looking for, that she was preparing for one. She was a woman who had learned to leave before she could be left, and he understood that, and he had told himself he would be patient, that there was time. But I'm grateful. As if what had passed between them, 3 days of the most genuine human contact he had experienced in longer than he could honestly account for, was something to be thanked for rather than continued. As if she were a guest at his table rather than, somehow, impossibly, already the thing he had not known was missing from his life. I have been very much more comfortable than I had any right to expect. Right to expect. As though she had assigned herself a ration of happiness and was conscientiously careful not to exceed it. He looked out the window at the white Somerset hills and felt something he had not felt since he was 26 and his father died and the full weight of everything descended. The specific fear of being too late. He had spent 4 years managing his life with perfect competence and complete numbness. He had attended every obligation, administered every estate, met every social duty with the impeccable thoroughness of a man who understood duty and had quietly given up on anything more. And then a woman in a green gown had told him she found despair more tolerable than temptation, and 3 days had undone 4 years, and she was on a coach to Bath because she believed without question, believed it so completely she hadn't even thought to question it, that she had no right to something more. The carriage crested a hill. There, 1.5 miles below on the valley road, was the Bath coach. Faster, Edmund said. The Bath coach stopped at the village of Compton for a change of horses. Cecily had been staring out the window at the white fields and the pewter sky and the occasional farm building and thinking about absolutely nothing at all with the dedicated thoroughness of someone thinking very hard about something specific, when the carriage door opened. Not the coach door. A carriage door, the door of a very good private carriage that had pulled up alongside with a speed suggesting some urgency, and then Edmund Vane, Duke of Ravenscroft, was standing in the road in the snow with his hat in his hand and no particular expression of composure about him whatsoever. The coachman stared. The other 2 passengers stared. Cecily stared. Lady Cecily, he said, and his voice was steady, but only technically. Would you step out, please? Your Grace. Please. She looked at him for 1 moment. Then, without entirely understanding why, she took the coachman's extended hand and stepped down into the snow. He took 3 steps toward her, and then stopped, as if he had rehearsed getting here and not what came after. The snow was beginning again, light and purposeful, falling between them like something that had decided to be present for this. You left, he said. The road was open. I know. He looked at her. Cecily. She felt the name. Not Lady Cecily, just her name. The way he had started saying it yesterday evening with a quietness that felt like something being allowed, and she pressed her hands together inside his gloves. She had kept his gloves. She had not intended to. She had simply put them on that morning and found she could not take them off. This is not, she began. I need you to stop, he said. Deciding what this is and isn't before I've had the chance to say it. She stopped. He took a breath. The snow fell. Somewhere behind them, the village of Compton went about its business with magnificent indifference to what was happening on its road. I have spent 4 years, Edmund said, being extremely competent and moderately miserable. I have managed everything available to me and wanted nothing I was actually permitted. I have attended Christmas at Ravenscroft Park and felt nothing in particular, and I have filled my house with guests and felt thoroughly alone, and I have accepted all of this because I had come to believe that this was simply what life was. He paused. And then I sat down across from a woman eating pheasant alone by 7 candles, and she told me she preferred despair to temptation because she'd considered the consequences, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing I did not know I was looking for. Cecily's throat had closed. She said nothing. You wrote that you are grateful, he continued, and his voice tightened slightly on the word. You wrote it as a closing, as if 3 days of being the most genuinely human I have felt in years was something to be neatly acknowledged and departed from. As if you had been extended a courtesy and were dutifully returning it. I didn't, she started. I know what you were doing, he said quietly. You were protecting yourself from the expectation of something you believe you have no right to expect. I know this because I recognized it the moment I read the word. She looked at him. His expression was entirely unguarded in a way she had not seen on any face, certainly not a duke's face, in years. Not performing calmly, not managing the moment, just present, open, afraid of the wrong answer in a way that was completely and entirely human. Edmund, she said, and her voice was not steady. What you are saying is not, it isn't reasonable. We have known each other for 3 days. Yes, you are a duke. Yes. I am a woman with no fortune, a let estate, a brother in Edinburgh for reasons we don't discuss, and a letter of reference as my primary asset. I am aware of all of this. Then you must understand why I understand, he said, that you have spent so long believing you have no right to more than what is merely available to you, that you have made yourself so careful, so excellent at being content with less, that you have almost forgotten you're allowed to want something. And I am asking you, I am standing in the snow on a Somerset road asking you to consider, just for a moment, wanting something. She felt the tears before she was aware of deciding to cry. She blinked hard. Her voice broke slightly. This is very inconvenient. Despite everything, he laughed. That real laugh, low and surprised. It is spectacularly inconvenient. I have an estate in Derbyshire. My mother will have extremely strong feelings. And my coachman is currently pretending to examine a wheel he has no interest in. Your mother. My mother, he said, with the calm of a man who has decided something, will accustom herself. She is capable of it when given sufficient reason. And I intend to provide her with sufficient reason. Cecily looked at him standing in the road in the snow and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. The feeling of being chosen. Not tolerated. Not accommodated. Not employed or required or kept politely at the edge of someone else's life. Chosen. Edmund, she said, I am not. I cannot promise you that I won't be frightened. That I won't. I'm frightened, he said simply. I have been frightened since I sat down at your table and realized I was about to do something I could not take back. I would like to be frightened together if you're willing. The snow fell between them. Those are my gloves, he said quietly. She looked down at her hands. Yes, I noticed you took them. She stopped. I'm glad you did, he said. I want you to keep them. I want. He reached out and took both her gloved hands in his bare ones, and the warmth of him even against December was entirely real. I want there to be many more things of mine that you keep. I want to give you a library with better heating than the one at Hartwell. I want to argue with you about Hume until one of us concedes and the other feels guilty. I want. His voice dropped to something very quiet and entirely certain. "To give you a table that is never set for one." She broke. Not dramatically. There was no spectacular collapse. She simply stepped forward and put her forehead against his shoulder and pressed her gloved hands against his chest and let herself, for the first time in years, lean. He put his arms around her immediately, as if he had been waiting to, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, and held her while the snow came down around them and the bath coach continued on without her. "You are being very irrational," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "For a man who manages drainage systems." "Completely," he agreed. "I find I don't regret it." She lifted her head. His expression, close now and entirely unguarded, was the most honest thing she had looked at in years. "Neither do I," she said. He kissed her then, in the road in Somerset with the snow as witness and his coachman absolutely inspecting that wheel, and it was not grand or theatrical. It was simply true. The kind of kiss that means not this moment but all the moments after this. When they parted, her cheeks were cold and her eyes were bright and he was smiling with the whole of his face. "Come to Derbyshire," he said. "Let me introduce you to a Yule log the size of a small tree and 40 guests and my mother's expression." "Your mother's expression sounds alarming." "It is. You'll manage it beautifully." She looked at him. "You have considerable faith in me." "I have observed you," he said. "It is not faith. It is evidence." She took his offered arm. "Edmund." "Yes. Happy Christmas," she said. Belatedly, he covered her hand on his arm with his warm and steady. "Happy Christmas, Cecily." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft was a woman who had raised a formidable son and survived a formidable marriage and was not, she would have known, easily surprised by anything. She was surprised by Cecily Ashmore. She had expected, when Edmund's rider arrived at Ravenscroft Park on the evening of the 28th with a letter that said, in Edmund's characteristic economy, "I am bringing a guest. Please have the blue rooms prepared. Her name is Lady Cecily Ashmore, and I intend to marry her." She had expected someone. She had not expected this particular someone. She had expected beauty deployed as a weapon, or breeding produced like a credential. She had expected a woman who flinched under a Dowager Duchess's assessment, or alternatively one who bristled at it with defensive sharpness. She had not expected a woman who looked her directly in the eye over the tea service and said, with pleasant composure, "I expect you have considerable reservations, Your Grace. I would welcome the opportunity to address them if you like. I find direct conversation more efficient than mutual wariness." The Dowager Duchess had stared. Edmund, from across the room, had looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man refraining from smiling. "You are very direct," the Dowager Duchess had said. "I have been a companion for 3 years, Cecily replied. "I have learned that managing the feelings of those in my care is considerably easier when I understand what those feelings actually are." "And what are my feelings, in your estimation?" "Protect your son, suspicious of my motives." And a slight pause, curious, despite yourself. A silence. Then the Dowager Duchess had set down her teacup and said, "Sit down, Lady Cecily. We are going to have a proper conversation." They had. It had taken most of the afternoon, and Edmund had been banished to his study for the duration, and when he emerged for dinner Cecily had given him a look that communicated nothing precise but everything reassuring, and his mother had been more animated at dinner than he had seen her in years. "She's clever," the Dowager Duchess told him the following morning, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "Yes," Edmund agreed. "She has no money. I have sufficient money for both of us. People will talk." "People," Edmund said, "always talk. I have found I care considerably less about it than I previously believed." The Dowager Duchess looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice only slightly softer than her usual register, "You look well, Edmund. Better than you have in years." "I am well," he said. "Better than I have been in years." She gave a small nod, which was, from the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, approximately equivalent to a lesser woman throwing her arms open and weeping with joy. "Then see that you don't waste it," she said, and returned to her correspondence. They were married in March, quietly, with the Somerset snow long melted and the first signs of green coming through in the Derbyshire hedgerows. Cecily wore cream silk and carried snowdrops. not because it was traditional, but because Edmund had gone out that morning and found them at the edge of the garden and brought them in without comment, and she had looked at them on the breakfast table and felt something so full she had to sit down. Thomas Ashmore came down from Edinburgh for the wedding, thin and cautious and watching his sister with the expression of a man trying to determine whether the extraordinary thing he has heard is real. Edmund shook his hand and said something quiet that Cecily didn't hear, and Thomas looked up with a slightly less cautious expression and said, "Right, yes, good," which was, for Thomas, emphatic. The 40 guests came. The Yule log had been replaced by spring flowers. The Dowager Duchess sat at the head of the table and observed the proceedings with an expression that anyone who knew her would identify, on close inspection, as satisfaction. At the wedding breakfast, when the last toast had been made and the afternoon had settled into the warm murmur of people finding the people they wanted to talk to, Edmund took Cecily's hand under the table and said, very quietly, 7 candles. She turned to look at him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about those 7 candles, on that table at Hartwell Inn. Someone lit them for you." "The innkeeper's wife," Cecily said. "Every Christmas." "Yes." He looked at her. "I've been thinking that someone lit them faithfully year after year, for a woman she knew would come and sit alone. And I've been thinking that she must have believed, that innkeeper's wife, that the right person would come one day and sit down across from those candles." Cecily's hand was very still in his. "I pulled up that chair," Edmund said, "because you looked as if you needed company, but I stayed." He turned to look at her fully. "I stayed because you were the only person in that room who had not the faintest idea how remarkable you were, and I found that I could not leave without telling you." "You didn't tell me," she pointed out. "Not in so many words. I followed you down a Somerset road in the snow," he said. "I believe the meaning was conveyed." She laughed, and the laugh was the one he had been cataloguing privately since the first evening. Unguarded, entirely genuine, the laugh of a woman who has stopped performing happiness and started feeling it. "It was conveyed," she agreed. "Good." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was domestic and entirely private in the midst of 40 guests and the general celebration, and she leaned against his shoulder very briefly, just for a moment, the way she had in the road in the snow, and then straightened again with the composure of a duchess. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. Next Christmas," she said. "We are lighting 8 candles." He understood immediately, not 7 for 1 but 8 for 2, and the expression that crossed his face was one she intended to spend a very long time making possible. 8 candles, he said. "And the pheasant? And the pheasant. And Darwin in the library? And Darwin. And Newton. And Hume. For the arguments. And the wren in the hedge, if he obliges." "The wren," she said, "will oblige." She said it with the certainty of a woman who has decided, finally and without reservation, to believe in something. And the Duke of Ravenscroft, who had spent 4 years being competent and numb and thoroughly alone, looked at the woman beside him in the March sunlight and felt, with absolute and quiet certainty, that every year from this one forward would have more in it than he deserved and exactly as much as he had, without knowing it, always wanted. "Happy Christmas," he said in March, because some things deserve saying out of season. "Happy Christmas," she answered. "Always."